Lidded forms are an endless fascination of mine, and I think I'm safe in saying that there's no task I enjoy more than trimming a batch of these so that both components, both lid and jar, perfectly fit one another. For this group, I spent an hour throwing a batch of jars that were all quite different to each other, and for each I threw a matching lid. What you see here are the unrefined shapes. The surfaces are quite rough, and you can still see my fingerprints left on some of them. So this process isn't just a case of making the lid fit. Instead, I trim practically every outside surface of these pots. The glazes that will ultimately cover these go on quite thickly, which means I have to trim the clay work beneath it to be very sharp, as these edges will soften down somewhat after they've been glaze fired. In this video though, I'll be trimming a few of these jars, and I'll be discussing what's arguably my favourite process, which is trimming and refining pots. I begin with the lid, which is centered and held in place with 3 lumps of soft clay, and as you can see, the rim of the locating flange on this lid is undulating quite wildly, which is something I will correct. But first, I trim the outside portion of the locating flange so that the jar fits very snugly around it. And at this point it didn't quite fit perfectly, and the good thing about having the lid attached is I can just trim a tiny bit away, like so, and then immediately test the jar against it. Once the lid fits, I'll spend a moment or two correcting this undulation. For me, it doesn't need to be perfect. As soon as the wheel stops spinning, your eye can't really focus on the high or low points anymore. Plus, this portion of the lid will ultimately be hidden inside the jar, away from sight. This component isn't finished yet, but I won't finish turning it until a little bit later. To trim the jar, I brush some slip over the base of the pot, place it roughly into the centre, and then tap center it until it spins perfectly in the middle. And to seal the pot against the metal just that little bit further, I squash a tiny portion of the clay into the wheel. For trimming my stoneware pots, I mostly use these bison turning tools made by Philpo Burker, a legend in the pottery world, hence why there's a 5-month waiting list for any of his tools. This sharp tungsten bladed hook tool has been the one I've used a lot recently to remove mass and to trim lovely straight surfaces. Generally I dig the sharp angled corner of it, which really gouges away the clay quite effortlessly, and for the time being I'm just trimming this lower section to have a base that's more narrow. To add stability to my hand that's trimming, I occasionally take my left hand and place it over my right. This goes a long way into adding stability as I trim, but typically instead I'll trim with one hand whilst the other braces the pot, yet the two do still often connect, especially my thumbs. My left hand that moves around the pot is sort of like a sensor. It's the digits of this hand that'll feel if the pot is beginning to go off center, and it's also there to catch the pot just in case it does dislodge and come flying off, which happens from time to time. I can also use it to reach inside the pot as I'm trimming to feel the cross section of the walls opposite the area I'm turning. And really they work in unison, each hand informing the other, guiding the other. And if I was to try and only do this process via the physical response from the blade, the sensation of feeling it cut through the clay, then I'd be quite lost. It's at this point that you can see just how crisp a form I'm trying to get, especially with that sharp line around the waist, and I'll try to reflect that in the top edge of the lid itself. I then use the jar component as a chuck for the lid, and even though it does fit very tightly, I also keep it pinned down with a spinner on top. That's what that black and white object is. There's a ball bearing in it. The black part doesn't spin and the white part does, and it distributes the weight that's pushing down on top and prevents my fingertips from rubbing on the coarse clay. As for the angle that I'm turning onto this portion of the lid, I attempt to make it mirror the surface beneath it. I trim a slight concave hollow onto the tops of my lids. It's curved slightly, and to do that I need a curved blade, which I dig into the middle of the lid and gradually excavate my way down. I turn this pull with the hope that it encourages my glazes to pull thickly into it, which usually does work. Plus, it removes some weight from what could be quite a heavy component. After this part has been trimmed, I'll then go over the surfaces with the flat side of a metal kidney. This burnishes and smooths the clay. It also compacts any sharp specks of sand back into the clay body. Lastly, for the finer details, I use this much finer tungsten carbide blade for trimming sharp little ledges and the rim. I always do this part after I've turned the lid, as if I trim this portion to be quite thin and delicate beforehand, there's a chance the pressure needed to hold the lid down in place could be enough to crack this small supporting gallery. And whilst the chances of that happening are quite low, the fact that it has happened to me on a handful of occasions is enough for me to never do it that way round again. I don't trim much away from the top, rather I'm just refining the shape, trimming the gallery and making the edges all a bit cleaner. There remains though one very important place left to trim, and that's the base of the pot. And to do this, I flip the whole assemblage upside down, and then I use the lid of the jar, like a chuck, for the body. And as the lid is trimmed to fit so precisely, it holds the body above very securely. Yet, to keep the jar totally pinned down, I once again use a spinner, which is placed on top, which I push down through, which helps to hold the pot in place. You'll notice that the pot is undulating a bit as it spins. Much of that in the lower half I can correct, but once again, I don't really mind if it's only subtle, as once the pot's placed the right way up, and it isn't spinning around at such a fast pace, you simply won't see any of these irregularities. These sharp tungsten carbide tools can leave quite chatted surfaces, so after I've trimmed them smooth and got the pot's walls to the desired thicknesses, I'll briefly scrape over them with a sharp metal kidney, which essentially just smooths over any of the more prominent turning marks and leaves me with a cleaner surface. And at long last I can get started on the actual base of the pot, and I follow a sort of similar set of rules for all of my pots that aren't bowls, so that's anything that has a flat base, and that's simply to trim a beveled edge around the outside and then to smooth over the bottom, removing the wiring off marks that were left over from when I wired the piece off the wheel just after they were thrown. This is probably the most precarious part of turning the bottoms of these pots. It's the same pressure that's pushing down to slice away the clay is the same pressure that's holding it in place. Lastly, I push my maker's mark into the clay that's still quite relatively soft, and that's one piece turned. In reality, without any edits, it can take between 10 to 15 minutes per piece, depending on the complexity of the pot and how easily the process goes. You can see quite obviously for this one how the extra few millimeters I throw onto these lids makes them not fit. It's something I do purposefully, as I'd rather have lids that are slightly too big, which I can trim down to fit perfectly, as compared to throwing the lids perfectly accurately and then risking them potentially just being a bit too small, which means they'll rattle in place. At this stage when making pots, it's far easier to remove clay than it is to add it, and you always run the risk, when adding soft clay to leather hard clay, that cracks and splits might form. So instead, I just throw the flanges to be slightly wider and perhaps slightly thicker than need be. That way they'll always fit, and I can just trim them after the fact to make them nice and refined once again. And now the process repeats itself. I slip the base, rub it back and forth a few times, and then tap center it into the middle. I then seal the bottom using a corner of a rubber kidney, and then the turning can begin. The idea for this group of work is to have a whole line of jars, all of which are quite angular and are built up from straight sides and sharp edges. And then I'll coat each of them with a white crackle glaze, which will be reduction fired to cone 10. The wider base of this pot means I can trim it a bit more strongly without risking the vessel to be dislodged. When I'm turning pots, I never try to remove too much clay in any one swoop. Instead, I just take it off layer by layer, removing a millimetre or so at a time. At this stage, when the clay is in the perfect condition, the process of trimming pots is a very satisfying one. Whereas if you try and trim the clay when it's too soft, the pot itself will buckle and move, and the ribbons you trim away will just stick back onto the pot, and in many ways it makes the process of trimming more difficult, as does attempting to trim a pot that's too firm, as the sheer amount of pressure you'll need to push in with the tool will quickly cause your wrist to ache. Not only that, but the clay will only come off in very small shards, and once again, the entire process will end up taking far more time than it really need do. Trimming is just one of those things where the process becomes so much more straightforward when the clay is in the right condition. I'm often asked things like, how long do you let your pots dry out for before you trim them? And really there's no answer for that. I could simply say 1.5 days, but if you live in a much warmer country with a hotter studio and you're using a different type of clay body, they could dry out to the perfect condition in a fraction of the time. Likewise, if you live in a particularly cold country or a very humid one, your thrown pots could take longer to dry. So there isn't just one simple answer, and really it's one of those things that's learned through experience. Although I can give you a few pointers, I think. If your pot is leather hard and you clasp around the rim and it still gives and moves in quite easily, then it's probably too soft to begin trimming. For instance, when I'm trimming my mugs, if I gently squeeze the rim of the pot, I want them to be firm enough that they barely move. On the other hand, if you notice that parts of your leather hard pot are beginning to turn white and are approaching the bone dry stage, then those are probably too firm to trim, and I would quickly soak them in water and set them aside, as there is the possibility of saving a pot if it's just about approaching the too firm stage. I understand how at the beginning it can be quite difficult to judge this when you're new to the medium of clay, but you will quite quickly pick it up, together with figuring out how to store work for longer periods of time so that it doesn't dry out too much. Trimming the outer portion of this jar was quite an easy ordeal, but trimming the base was more of a challenge, especially when you see the undulation it has. Sometimes there isn't much you can do to rectify this, and in this instance I just trimmed it, even with that wobble, which meant spending some time initially rotating the pieces until they felt most centered, even if it never was perfect. And sometimes finding that point can be quite hard, and eventually I just got on with it, regardless. It's like you'll see at the end, even with these irregularities in the shape, once all lined up in a neat row, you won't be able to see them. And when I do begin to trim, you'll see just how much of a difference it can make. As this is wobbling around so much, I'm pushing down extraordinarily hard from on top. I clasp the tool so tightly that it only trims away the clay from the undulating spot, which leaves me with a form which is a bit more centered. I then trim the beveled edge, and then remove the spinner so that I can tackle the flat base of the pot. I begin by turning away the worst of the wiring off marks, whilst also thinning out the base somewhat, and then I'll switch to using a flat metal kidney to really burnish over the base and to smooth and soften the clay. Occasionally the lids will have a little bit extra which needs to be trimmed away too, and usually it's just a matter of tidying them up slightly, and then I can move on to trimming the next, and the next. And whilst it is quite slow going, I thoroughly enjoy the challenge each different shape provides. And although no two were alike, I trim them so they can at least reside within the same family of forms. Which means, of course, there are some I prefer to others, but that's all part of what makes producing these groups of pots quite interesting. And through this experimentation I sometimes find new forms that I really love. Perhaps the most unifying quality for all of these jars is the shapes of their lids, and they're really what remains a constant throughout these. And not only this batch of jars, but for my work as a whole. Somehow these quite substantial, overhanging lids have become a prominent feature of my design. I like how they cast quite a significant shadow beneath them, and the fact that they're raised up slightly creates quite a prominent groove, which is usually where they're lifted away from, which is why they don't have more prominent handles and knobs like many lidded jar forms do. Either way, I can't wait to see these all glazed up. By the time this video is technically released, I think I'll have fired them, so I'll have to make an updated video soon. But you may also be able to spy them on my Instagram page, which if you don't follow along there, you're missing out on many more photographs and videos, and all manner of other things. That's all for this week. Thank you, as always, for watching, and I'll see you next time.